In this movie, we learn how to specify what font our pages should use. And of course, effective and appropriate font choice is a keystone to all designs. Now, what fonts to actually use is a little bit beyond the scope of this course. However, if you're designing for web pages in particular, it's good to stick to a number of our clean sans serif fonts. Now, we will talk a little bit more about what sans serif is in this movie. However, if you really want to know a lot about it, you may have to invest some time studying graphic design and typography on the side. So our font choice will often heavily contribute to the overall tone of any design. So if we end up using the wrong font, then the wrong message could be sent. And of course, that's something that we probably want to avoid. In the world of CSS, we have the ability to set the font for our web pages to anything that we want. So if we are in love with a font, then we can specify that it be used in a design. And the way that we do this is by using the font family property. So here we have an example of the font family. So here we're setting the body contents to display in an Arial font. Now, if we end up having a specific font that we want to use that has a space in the name, we have to contain that name with quotation marks. Also note that these names are capitalized, and the reason that they're capitalized is because some operating systems are case sensitive when it comes to font names. So this is the basics of how we're going to designate which font should be used on our web pages. However, our end user may not have that font installed because it's going to be up to the operating system and the end user's machine to actually find this font. So if the font is not installed on that end user's computer, then you can forget about it being displayed with that particular font. Now, according to specification, we can actually embed fonts to be used in our designs, but the actual implementation was never fully delivered in a way that was satisfactory to everybody involved. Now, another reason why the end user may not have that font installed is because we have some slight differences between our different operating systems. Font names are sometimes slightly different between those operating systems, even though they may be equivalent fonts. So this whole idea of being able to specify whatever font you want is not exactly true because you have a lot of things you need to take into consideration. Now, because we can't really specify one specific font that we want, it's typically a good idea to set up a preference list. So here we have a preference list using Times, Times New Roman, and Liberation Serif. Each one of these fonts are more or less the equivalent across different operating systems. So Times is from your classic Mac environment, Times New Roman is from your Windows environment, and Liberation Serif is from a Linux environment. So the way that the browser works is it reads this in order of preference. So what it does is it says, okay, use Times. And it looks at the operating system, looks at the fonts, and says, there's no Times here. So try to use Times New Roman. So it moves on to the next font listed. If it can't find that, it moves on to the last one. At the end of looking, if it doesn't find any font that matches, it's just going to use whatever the default is for that operating system. And of course, that's not necessarily something that we want to have happen because that could actually destroy our design completely. So what we need to do is we need to add in a generic font family at the end as a catch-all, because all three of these fonts that you see are actually tied together because they're known as serif fonts. Now we're going to have 5 generic families of font that we can use: the serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Your serif fonts are typically going to have little extra feet on them, or extra flourishes. So what we're going to see whenever we take a look at our OpenSparks again is that it is using a serif font. Whenever we specify our font family, we're actually going to use a sans serif font. And our sans serif font is very similar to what you end up seeing on your screen right now on this slide. It does not have the extra flourishes. It was designed for screens for easy viewing. Monospace fonts are going to make it so that all of our characters in the font are roughly the same width. So with those monospace fonts, you're going to have legibility being key. With the cursive fonts, they're going to be like handwritten scripts or other decorative fonts. And lastly, with the fantasy fonts, they're going to be somewhat like those cursive in that they're decorative, but they don't actually fall into the cursive realm, and they don't fall into any other realm here. So those are the 5 generic font families that you're going to want to use as catch-alls. So let's go ahead and jump over into our OpenSparks and see about adding that. So if I take a look at the OpenSparks here, I'll notice that on a lot of our letters, particularly at the bottoms, you'll see these little extra feet that are sticking out and little flourishes. That's because we're using the default for our operating system. So it is using a serif font. So I'm going to take control of that by jumping into our main.css and adding in our rule to control the font used on the body. So I'll do font family, and I'm going to say I want to use Verdana, and if that's not available, use Arial, and if that's not available, use whatever the first sans serif is that you can find on that operating system. So I'll go ahead and save that. I'm going to jump back into my browser here, and I'll refresh, and we'll see the transformation. Instantly, a lot of our text becomes a little easier to read. So that's how we're going to be able to build our rules to specify our fonts. Now, if you are in love with a specific font and have to use that on your website, there's a few different ways that you can include that specific font, one of which is what we will use later, and that's your graphic text replacement. And essentially all you're doing is you're creating your text as a graphic and putting it into your web page as an image. There are a couple of other more complex methods, such as the scalable Inman flash replacement and the facelift image replacement, that will use JavaScript as well as some other technologies in there. Both of those methods are well beyond the scope of this particular course, but if you're interested in finding out more, I do recommend that you check it out. It may be worth your time. So that concludes this look at setting up fonts with CSS.